Hi, my name is Benedict. I wanted to introduce you to and walk you through Space Strike. Space Strike is the drum synthesizer in the Space Case collection, and it's a simple device, but it can deliver some great sounds. Also, probably before I rattle on too much about anything else, let's go through some sounds that I did make, and you can have a listen. So that gives you a sense of how it can work in a kit. What you probably noticed is that I've got one instance each of Space Strike for kick, snare, pair of hi-hats, and the ever necessary cowbell. They're sent through a mixer. There's a little bit of reverb from Space Reverb, a compressor just to keep everything nice and tight, and they're being triggered from a red drum. You could equally use a Kong here, or really any other device that you wanted. Most of the drum tracks on the Space Case album were actually handled by the new drum player in 10.1. So that was a joy to have and use because of the extra features, the flamming and ratcheting and things like that. Whether they made it onto the album, I don't specifically remember, but it's a cool device to have. So quite simply, it's set up that gate out to gate in. Not worrying about CVs in this case. I just want the trigger that arrives here to go here, and it does that job beautifully. So that's in a combinator, so that I just have to load once. That gives me a kit. If you are a Reason person and you've got this, then all you have to do is open that refill and find the Strike 1 patch, and then if you wanted to, you could open up any of these and adjust the instrument to suit. So there is something that starts you going. But remember, the whole thing about Space Case is it really does encourage you to build your sound. Now, a little bit of background on why we would do it this way, which we'll just kill this off now, we don't need it anymore. And open this fella up. So this is the instrument. A little bit of background, as I said, as to why we might want to do it this way, rather than having one sort of uber drum machine with 11 trillion samples and this, that, and the other. Yep, it's a popular way of doing things, but it's not the only way of doing things. And seeing the whole Space Case is about looking at how things were being done in the late 70s to early-ish 80s. So analog synths as they were, in their ascendancy or in their prime, and of course digital instruments in their early days. This covers a little bit of both. And in the very early days, going back a bit, Kraftwerk, the Human League, a lot of the drum sounds on those records were actually built with full synthesizers, because drum machines were pretty scarce on the ground back then, unless of course you had a home organ that was running an Acetone or something like that. But even so, a lot of the guys wanted to create really unique sounds. It was the sound of the future. So they didn't want drum samples, didn't want exactly the same sound as everybody else had on their record. So they were creating their instruments with the synthesizers. So from my understanding, the Human League's first couple of records, Reproduction and Travelogue, were essentially all drum sounds created on the System 100 and actually played in real time possibly through CV control, I don't know, but nonetheless they were synthesizer sounds, which is part of why they're such unique and charming records, because you haven't got the same 808 or 909 that absolutely everybody else was running, or the CR78s that everyone else was running at that time. So there's a lot to be said about doing it this way. So we'll give you a walk through the instrument. You've got two oscillators, a simple modulation section, so it's just an envelope with an attack, decay, release. Same over here with volume, and then a filter with various modes. But it's how these come together that makes the instrument and the sounds. So default kick, being a synth, it's set up with full keyboard. Obviously you can limit it, as you saw in a combinator, to only triggering one note or whatever you choose it to be, but it's designed that it'll work across the whole keyboard. So if you're playing with one of the styles, like I think it's trap, that wants drums that go across more than one note, this will do that for you. And also if you really want it to be very strange, you can have it play polyphonic. I made the decision to keep it polyphonic rather than monophonic. Yes, there can be a charm in those tom rolls or snare rolls where each hit cuts off the one before it, but it's a limited charm. If you really, really need that, then you can get that by sampling off into an NN and triggering it back in mono mode, or in through Kong or anything like that. I thought it was better to allow you that little bit more flexibility and that slightly more natural sound. So if we walk through, we'll get rid of that and just walk through. Got deliberately a pretty broad tuning range. This isn't designed specifically to be a kick drum emulator. It's designed for percussion sounds across the board, so everything from kick drums up to strange little bird tweets or whatever you find in between. Oscillator wave shapes, you've got the expected sine, but I've also left in the other shapes. Pulse is a set to a square, and noise. Yes, there's a fair chance that these other shapes are of little use. I mean, maybe you'll want the pulse if you're deciding that you need to create something like the old Casio drum sounds from Trio's Da Da Da. Cool, amusing. They're there. It just seemed to make no sense to not have them there, seeing it cost me nothing more. I already had the controls and what have you. Tuning. You've got options as to how the tuning behaves. We've got free, which is what you've heard before. We'll just open this up a wee bit. So it moves smoothly. You can move to so what that's doing is constraining the movements to just octave movements. Not a lot of uses for it, but again, I had the setup there, so it seems silly not to use it. And constrained to semitone. Strikes me this one's more useful for certain composers who are wanting to tune particularly kick drums to, say, the root of the piece. So if you know that the root of your piece is A, then you can go through here, tune it until you find the right semitone. Otherwise, most of the time you're going to want that in free mode. Now please bear in mind I'm wearing a set of $15 headphones. They're Jane's Skype headphones. I've got a set of AKGs on order, but they haven't shown up yet. So I actually can't hear too accurately what I'm producing in this. So if you hear me make sounds that are like, "Ooh, geez, they're a bit off," not the fault of the synthesizer. It's just these cans are way better than buds, which is not hard but not good enough to know what I'm doing. Next knob, that's your modulation. So attack and decay. Gives you a fair amount of control over a lot of different kinds of sounds. So there we've got a very clicky start. We can control how we get rid of this. The attack here is deliberately very, very fast, so you're definitely going to hear DC clicks here, which is typical of those instruments, through to slower than you'd need it to be, unless of course you happen to be making a sound effect that wants to be slow. So a fair amount of flexibility there. And as you've heard, it'll go very long as well. So that long envelope means that you can get into doing future bass, or whatever it's called, the overly long 808 decay thing. The other thing that we could do with a very long, with a very sharp attack, if there's a little bit too much clicky on the front there, is bring our filters into play. At least in these little boxes, that actually sounds pretty cool. You see I've used a high pass resonance to emphasize the cutoff, which means it's actually creating a kind of a bass boost. A little bit of modulation. At least in these plastic boxes, that sounds like quite a tight little sound. Get rid of that. Next oscillator, exactly the same waves, exactly the same tuning options, a volume, can modulate both ways. So you can set it so that your modulation envelope works or positive. So it gives you quite a lot of flexibility. As to how you want to create sounds. So using a different waveform there, take advantage of the extra harmonics. If we've got too many of them, now remember, you might sort of go, oh, but geez, I don't want the envelope to be the same on each of these because you've only given us one mod envelope, Benedict. Yeah, I've deliberately only given you one mod envelope. Remember, all of the instruments, all of the effects in Space Case are really designed to be very basic, but then to have the extra control flown in via modulation. So being a reason man, that's all CVs. So if you fly in another CV envelope, then you can give different enveloping to the volume of the second oscillator, to the pitch movement of the second oscillator. You can bring in another envelope or an LFO to control the filter. So there's one there because that's the basics of what you need, and it will give you enough options to do whatever you want, but don't feel like you're limited to that. Now here's the other thing that this will do. You can add FM. And yes, sometimes it will get very nasty Nyquisty, as I've spoken about in 102, the synth there. It's a sound of the time. I refuse to fight it. I accept that it's there. If I don't like those notes, I won't use those notes, or I'll just filter them out or whatever. I refuse to go down the road of saying that they're bad things. They're nature of the beast, and I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater or mix my metaphors any further. Very nice usable bell sounds. I'm not recommending this to be used as a polyphonic synth per se. Obviously you've got some tuning concerns, although you can pull this into tune. Remember, you've got those options. Next thing you're going to want to hear are some snare type sounds. So as you see, what we're doing there is FMing the noise into, so we're imprinting the noise in the tone, which is one way of attacking it. So it's giving us quite a lot of flexibility, and more flexibility than you would have if you were just using an 808 type instrument, because there you're just balancing between noise and oscillator, but here we can actually print that in which changes the way that core oscillator works, which I don't know all of the physics of what happens to a snare drum when you hit it. Obviously it creates a little bit of tone, but that snare creates a whole pile of noise as well, and that's got to be affecting the actual body of the instrument and creating noise there as well. So we can use all the tones, or we can use a pair of these things to create all manner of sort of variations. It is one of those things where taking the time is going to change the results that you get, most definitely. So easy to initially kind of get nothing, and then perhaps to think, oh well, I'll never get anything of any use out of this. The trick is to work out how to get those different types of sounds out of the instrument. And once you do, and you're prepared to get your own sound, then you may not reach for it every single time, but any time where you realize that you don't want that same of yet another set of samples of well, really 808s and 909s, because they're the ones that everybody seems to sample ad nauseum, then you can reach for a drum synth. Kong does have very nice little units in there, but they don't sound like this fella. So variety can very much be a spice of life, or curry. The other thing I just want to show you that it can do, if you hadn't already thought about it before, is that you can have this control from outside. So there's going to be a wee bit on the wild side to start with. Without spending too much time, let's see if we can bang it into something that we might call a usable sound. Filter, we're not going to want much movement there at all. FM, we've got leaping around like a drunkard. We do not want that. Far too much control. There we go, there's our core problem. Just going to smooth that off. So if that were a snare, what we've got there, and this is not a great example because I would really want to do this in the mix. I'd be making my drums, then I'd be doing this kind of work, the adjustments in the mix, because something that sounds great on its own with drums, I find, overawes the mix. But you get your mix working, get everything working quite nicely, then I'll add a little bit of variety into how the drums are behaving. So a little bit of tuning drift there will give you a lot more flexibility in the overall feel of that instrument, and it makes it feel more organic. It moves around a little bit in the mix. Rant on samples, I guess, coming right now. Listen or don't listen. I personally think that the use of samples over and over again, especially seeing, as I mentioned before, we're largely using the same core sounds, even if they're processed. While you make you feel like, oh, I got that sound, there's also a huge unoriginality about it, which listeners do hear. They like what's familiar, yes, I'll give you that. But they're also looking for something new and exciting. And one of the reasons why a lot of people are re-looking at the 80s is because for them it feels like a time that was new and exciting. They didn't live through it. I lived through it. And it was new and exciting then, and if I pop on a John Foxx record now, it's new and exciting still. And that's something that I think is very much missing in the modern music, and one of the problems is because they're using samples, because every time you hear that sound is exactly the same. So it's like having a conversation with somebody who has two words and they use those same two words over and over again. Gonna get dull. So one of the advantages of using a drum synth and flying in CVs and movement is that you're going to end up with a more unique, evolving sound, especially if you do something like what we're doing here and moving that sound around. So I think if you're looking to have music that seems more engaging or feels more engaging, then look very much at this. The other issue is related, is the sample loop, and I know to some extent we've moved past that, but there are lots of people using Rex loops as well. Doesn't make them wrong, but we've changed the way that we used to do them. If you listen to Public Enemy, which was the early days of grabbing a loop off a record and creating an underpinning of your own track from that, they trigger the sample, and yes, everyone talked about, oh, you sample it and you loop it. That is not how tracks were made. You sampled it, you triggered it, and then you triggered it again. So if you've got 4 bars, you trigger it, and in 4 bars time you trigger it again. The very early days when they were doing that, they didn't really have much in the way of sequences. So they were taking their best guess as to what tempo it was, which meant they were wrong. They were close, but they were wrong. And triggering it once every 4 bars, because if you hit your loop, like triggered it once, hit loop, because you were wrong on your BPM, it meant that it was only so many bars before you were actually completely out of time, which is why it was trigger every 2 bars or 4 bars, however long your sample was. And that meant that while you were hearing the same thing, it also lurched every time the loop came back around again, which managed to keep enough interest. It got boring when you heard every single person doing exactly the same thing, but if you listen to, again, as I say, some of that early Public Enemy or Mars's Pump Up the Volume, that's all over the place. If anybody were to put that together in a modern DAW, they'd be horrified as to how loose it was. But it's part of what made that such a vibrant record. The way they were putting it together, it was full of errors. Their movement, that's human movement. So use loops, use all of those things. But if you've got a loop, then you could perhaps fly in another instrument that's moving around. And we create movements here that create a uniqueness that's in your record, and you create the movement in your record as you're going. And I know that everybody's hell-bent on making very drum-heavy mixes, so rather than saying, oh, I'll create a little bit of movement by whacking some chords on top, which you really haven't thought through, because you're not thinking about creating a melody, you're just going, oh, I'll just create some movement. Listen to early Haas. All they did was just go. That was it. If you want to compare, get something like Alphaville's Big in Japan, and then the remix of Big in Japan. They gutted the melody. Yes, you've got bigger drums and what have you, but you actually gutted that track. Doesn't mean that I removed it from my best of, but it's nowhere near as interesting. There's a reason why it didn't go back up the charts when they did a remix of it, and when they were looking at redoing Forever Young to put it in that TV show, they no doubt considered, well, should we just do a remix? Should we just grab the original track and do a remix or a housey version or whatever was en vogue at the time they did that? No, that's why they said, let's get in a band. They got in a rock band, and oddly enough, the kids had no idea what they were covering because they'd never heard the song before. But it wasn't a bad cover. But the reason that they did that, and the reason that it worked, and they managed to have a hit again with that song, was because at least it was real. It wasn't gutted. So if you're making very drum-heavy mixes, this is why I'm sort of, I guess, belaboring that point, that rather than using samples, make your own sounds. Even if you do sample them off, I guess, to some extent, but the downside of sampling them off is that you lose movement. Maybe what you could do is make 5 samples, put them into NNXT and tick the random every strike. That gives you some movement. It's whatever you do, this is the option. Even if you do use a stock loop and everything's stock in time, or you're using drum samples, why not fly in a few sounds? They can be really odd sounds, really weird sounds. Pop that inside a mix. I was listening to something or other this morning, and Spice Girls, one of their tracks popped up on my alarm, and there's a sound like a frog in that. Never give up on a good time, that's the trouble. You've got the loop, which is a very solid, rigid loop, and then every now and then you've got this sort of that comes in, and that's a way of having broken up that drum track by using an unexpected, unusual sound. I remembered it. It's a cool track. Basically all the Spice Girls stuff of those first 2 records was cool because they thought carefully about what they were doing, or the guys who are making the songs. So try and finish the Rant now. Variety. And that's a big part of what Space Case is about. It's about bringing in organic variety to your music. And that's why they lack things, so that the way that you bring in your movement is going to be unique to you, rather than just photocopying what everybody else is doing, in the hope that people aren't bored enough with that yet. My 10 cents, which I've been giving for a little while, is that what we've been hearing in music for the last 10 or so years, or 20 years, has to be just about over. It has to be. This has been one of the longest times in the history of rock and roll and music in general, but very much the history of rock and roll. So we're going back to mid to late 40s. So if we're sort of talking old Hank Williams, if we're using him as a starting point, up to whatever we're being tortured with on the charts right now, we had moves, and quite noticeable moves, every 3 to 5 years. But really we haven't had any noticeable move since maybe the mid-90s. The early 90s, we did have some interesting things come through. We had Faith No More and Jane's Addiction, Carter the Unstoppable Sex Machine. There was some variety. There were some real serious problems because we were getting incredibly narrow in the music that we were doing. But there were still some really interesting and unusual things coming out. But then that stopped, definitely by the time we hit the 2000s. So what have we had since then? It's 18 years since then. All we can point to are very, very tiny, microscopic movements that we pretend is a whole new genre. But is what Skrillex did really any different from what Front 242 did, only in the volume of editing? No, it's not. But we're not hearing any more of it. Skrillex ran his course because that whole chop everything to buggery had nowhere to go. It was a logical conclusion in itself. The whole Adele, the singing in a funny lame voice thing, that's got nowhere to go. So keep hammering down the path you're going by all means, but my 2 cents here is very much, I think you're on a dangerous path if you're doing it, because there has to be revolution, there has to be change. Either that or the audiences just don't want interesting music anymore, in which case ignore absolutely everything that I have said in this video. Do not buy this stuff. Just find the same samples that everybody else is using and keep making exactly the same stuff. Of course, if I'm right and you keep doing that, suddenly you're going to be so incredibly yesterday, and you're really not going to know how to move forward for those audiences, like we had in the early 80s, where audiences suddenly wanted to hear really new and interesting things. So the stuff that was on the pop charts, Flock of Seagulls, Thompson Twins, Gary Newman, then the times where he scaled the charts, Devo. Each of these acts was really unique. Men Without Hats did not sound like Devo, even though people thought, oh, they're kind of similar, hence the name, We Don't Wear Hats. We need to be in a time, and I think that that's going to happen pretty soon, where suddenly audiences are going to shun that, oh no, it's exactly the same sound we had before. So why not get ahead of the curve and at least learn, even if you're going to be cavalier and say, I'm going to make exactly the same sound until I'm no longer making $1 out of it. Good on you, fair business decision. But if the winds change and you haven't learned, then you're going to find yourself being usurped when that change comes. And God forbid, I hope it comes really soon, because music needs to be interesting again. Okay, I really will end the rant. I have been introducing you to Space Strike, which is the drum synth in the Space Case collection. Hope you find some use from it. Thank you.